Virtually every new technology, especially in the information area, gives rise to some fear that we're losing power in the marketplace. But we always have that power. As much as we may feel uncomfortable with new technologies, our money, our time, our effort still drives the decisions that marketers make. If we are scared about AI and its implications, we have the power to pull it back by voting with our own dollars. I remain convinced of that.
Hello, welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today is October 26, 2023, and I'm delighted to have on a guest who's kind of on the front lines talking about, taxes, but also artificial intelligence, technology. What are they doing up in DC to influence all of our lives? And it's none other than Pete Sepp. Pete, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, it's really a pleasure to have you on. You are doing some great work up there, so I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Before we get going, for the audience, let me go ahead and read your bio, and then we'll jump right into it. So Pete Sepp is president of the nonprofit, nonpartisan National Taxpayers Union's Government Affairs, Public Relations, and Development Activities. Pete also oversees strategic planning for NTU and its staff and supervises the research and education operations of NTU Foundation. Since beginning his service with NTU in 1988, Pete has written and edited numerous policy papers, informational publications, and many other writings. He has testified before Congress on many issues and lectured in the United States and abroad on issues such as tax administration reform and other issues, including balanced budget constitutional amendment. Pete regularly provides interviews and commentaries on radio programs and media outlets, and he graduated cum laude from Webster University in St. Louis, Missouri, with a degree in history and political science. So, with all that said, Pete, why do you do what you do every day?
I guess it goes back to when I was first answering phones for NTU as a lowly employee in 1988. And my second call, my second day on the job, was a fellow who was literally sobbing into the receiver saying he was at the end of his rope because he had gotten several notices of tax due from the IRS. The Internal Revenue Service wouldn't listen to his complaints and tried to prove his innocence, which is already a backward proposition there. And he said that if I couldn't help him, he was going to end his life. And I thought to myself, wow, all of a sudden, a 23-year-old having to make use of his psychology courses in a way he never thought he would. And to me, it occurred that we need better protection and to give better voice to taxpayers in this country. We should be asking the question of whatever government is doing, is it serving taxpayers, and how can taxpayers be protected when government goes off the rails? And it's not just the IRS, it's lots of other federal agencies, which we'll get into later.
Yeah. No, I love that. I'm glad that we have folks like you who are looking out for the taxpayer, because too often it feels like we're overrun by all these taxes and complexity and burdens that are going on. And so we really need that throughout. What are some of the big topics that, you work on at NTU?
One of the biggest topics remains the $80 billion in additional funding that the Internal Revenue Service received in the Inflation Reduction Act a year ago. That's been whittled down to $60 billion. Thanks to the passage of the Fiscal Responsibility Act earlier this summer. But $60 billion is still a lot of money for the IRS to play around with. And Congress gave the agency virtually no instructions on how to use it. 3 paragraphs in the Inflation Reduction Act saying, spend this much on enforcement, spend this much on services, spend this much on modernization. We'll see you later. That's not the way you transform an agency that is meant to serve taxpayers rather than, unfortunately, abuse taxpayers all too many times. And so we have to put guardrails on that funding and the agency. That's a big priority. Other big priorities, well, we have to get a budget passed that makes sense. The House of Representatives has about 2/3 of its work left ahead of us in passing appropriation bills that can actually bring federal spending back under control. They did a good job before the whole speaker debacle blew up. They need to get right back at it right now because time is running out on the current continuing resolution that they passed.
Yeah. November 17th. We're coming up to that very quickly. They just seem like they can't get their act together. It's kind of one thing after another, unfortunately. And it's Democrats and Republicans, in a lot of ways. And I worked in the Trump administration for a year as a chief economist for the Office of Management and Budget. And so I saw a lot of the inner workings of what happens in the belly of the beast, if you will. There were some of us, Russ Vought and others, who were trying to cut spending and cut regulations, but not everyone was. And at the same time, you have a Congress that's hard to get anything passed. And you're right, the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course was a misnomer, it contributed to more inflationary pressures that are out there. But this idea that if we just spend more money for the IRS to go after people more, we can bring in more revenue to reduce the deficit, just never really made sense to me. I mean, do you find any sort of idea that will actually happen?
Well, no. And part of the problem here, of course, the Republicans, especially on the Senate side, have remained fixated on holding the IRS to this promise that the Treasury Secretary made that we're not going to audit anyone making less than $400,000 a year with this new money that we're going to get. Well, if you read the IRS's own strategic plan that they put out after they got this money dumped in their laps, you can see, okay, even if they keep that promise, audits are not the only way the IRS goes after taxpayers. There's math error notices, underreporter notices, the non-filer program. They're pouring resources into those programs right now, and people with less than $400,000 have targets on their backs. That's a major taxpayer rights crisis waiting to happen.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't realize all that. But yeah, it's something we need to overcome. And you're right. We've got to get our fiscal house in order. I mean, this is kind of what I talk a lot about on the Let People Prosper show is we need to pass sustainable budgets, whatever type of budgets you want to call it, that at least can start to slow the growth. I mean, I would like to see them cut the budget. That's an uphill battle. I don't know when that will ever happen, but at least put in some guardrails, like you said, to start to rein in the growth of spending, because we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. And right now revenue is down as the economy is weakened and things of that nature, but spending continues to soar even after the pandemic and all the increase of about $7 trillion in new national debt. We've got to get back to some form of sanity. Before we get into all the AI stuff, we're going to get there, and technology and everything else. What do you find at NTU and just your work that we could do to start to rein this in and get it back on some sort of form of sanity?
Well, over the long term, certainly constitutional limits on taxes and spending are very important. But, the short term has to focus on what we can do given the fact that government is divided and that the political parties are arguing. Well, I think one place to start would be the bipartisan budget process reforms that the Senate Budget Committee has come up with. That was the late Mike Enzi of Wyoming, and currently the chairman, Chairman Reed. They've come up with a whole raft of ways that Congress can put more structure into the budget process, biennial budgeting, points of order against budgets that are straying outside spending limits or are taking up unrelated topics. Do those things. They're not as good as constitutional amendments, but to your point, Vance, show the outside world, especially investors, that they're serious about at least making a start toward fiscal responsibility. That will help us not only in the long run, but in the short run to avoid things like further downgrades of our sovereign debt. I mean, I'm shocked at how much more expensive it is to finance a federal borrowed dollar now than it was even a year ago. It's going to be, within the space of another year, it's going to be twice as expensive as it was in 2021. And as we keep holding these treasury auctions, retiring some debt and buying up new debt, the cost of servicing all of this is going to be astronomical. It's going to skyrocket in just a couple of years. That's going to have a problem that even left-wingers should care about as it crowds out other federal spending programs.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I like your approach there. I know that there's talk about a debt commission or a budget commission right now, which I think would be another good step in the right direction. The problem, and you probably share this concern too, is oftentimes we have these commissions with new ideas, but they don't implement them.
Yeah.
And so I would like to see some teeth along with what these commissions do, because we've got to get this. To me, Pete, the biggest national crisis to me is the national debt and our spending and tax situation that's out there. And it's something we've really got to get control over, to your point, because interest rates are soaring. Inflation, I think, is going to be coming back, because I don't see that the Fed is going to be able to keep interest rates low and not raise their balance sheet again. And so these are all hurting American families, especially the neediest among us are getting hurt. And if we're also going to have to worry about the IRS coming after us, it's like, where does it stop? It's maddening.
That's right. Exactly. And, you have to get a kick out of President Biden and his Treasury Secretary Yellen saying, well, we can afford this $105 billion aid package. We can finance it easily. I mean, do they read their own Treasury's weekly auction sheets about how much this is costing? We need to find offsets for any new thing the federal government does. You've got to go back and find an old thing that they're doing that they don't have to do anymore. And equally offset that cost. I mean, that was a goal in the Trump administration with regulations. Enact a new one, repeal two, repeal more. But you have to clean out the cobwebs before you start putting up new ones.
Amen. I totally agree with you. All right. Well, we could talk about that all day, and maybe we could have another episode on that. But I really wanted to get into some of the AI stuff. But, when you talk to folks, I talk to my family and friends and others, this is something that really concerns them about what's happening with AI and technology and everything else. And, I loved having you on because I want to get your perspective on what's happening here in the AI sector. Where do you like to start? Because there's so much that's going on in AI and technology in general. Where do you like to start with it?
I like to start with antitrust, and that can sound like a very boring topic, and it certainly can be, but taxpayers have a big stake in how the government enforces antitrust and competition policy. In other words, how does the Federal Trade Commission, how does the Department of Justice approach companies that under federal law might be deemed engaging in anti-competitive behavior or deceptive acts and practices? This is a power that is on the same level of the power that the IRS can have over businesses' lives and consumers' lives as a result. The Federal Trade Commission under Chair Lina Khan, for example, is pursuing all kinds of exotic theories about antitrust that would allow them to regulate non-disclosure agreements between businesses and employees. They want to revise merger and acquisition guidelines so that virtually any size business, I mean, all the way down to ones in the millions or tens of millions of dollars seeking to acquire another, would be subject to pre-approval by the FTC. I mean, that is total regulation of how and where businesses organize. Can you imagine the taxpayer resources that would require for the FTC to do? But even more importantly, the slowdowns in innovation that taxpayers count on, not only to make government more efficient, but to keep the economy growing. And I mean, when you think about it, public officials should be absolutely and directly interested in policies that encourage economic growth. It's the easiest way to raise revenues. Just make sure the economy's expanding. You don't have to raise tax rates or do anything with the tax laws. The money just comes in. And yet public officials constantly create regulatory policies that won't do that.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. And I'm glad you started there, because I do think that it's not well understood about antitrust. You have the Sherman Antitrust Act. We've had the Consumer Welfare Standard, which has helped to provide an objective metric for us to use over the last half century, that Lina Khan, Cantor over the DOJ, and others are basically wanting to throw out and say, you know what, this doesn't work anymore. And to me, and I'd love to get your take on this, Pete, but to me, it seems more like a political game now. We don't like certain industries. We don't like certain companies. Let's make sure that we have a tool to go after them, no matter if the consumers are being satisfied or not. I mean, basically, that's the Consumer Welfare Standard. Are consumers being better off or worse off? And there are different metrics, that we could go through of how that works. But it just seems like this is a step towards, ultimately the road to serfdom, as Frederick Hayek said, but not the capitalism that we know, because what we want is more competition. Competition allows to weed out the bad actors that are in the system. And if consumers are demanding the services of Google or of Amazon or whoever else it may be that they want to go after next, why is that such a bad thing? But like,
Right.
what is their perspective here?
Yeah, the perspective is generally that bigness is badness. And that's going back to the days of Louis Brandeis on the Supreme Court, the Brandeisians, they were called, and now they're called the Neo-Brandeisians, Cantor and Kahn and the rest of them. And they want to jettison the consumer welfare standard. And as you say, the result is a kind of politicized rent seeking that we don't want to see in our economy. You know, to quote another economist, we interviewed Milton Friedman just prior to his death about the antitrust going on in the late 90s. This was when Microsoft was being sued, and he observed, and he always had these great quips about how Silicon Valley had this suicidal instinct in trying to bring in the government to mediate disputes among large tech companies at the time. That's what's going on here in the Google lawsuit and the Amazon lawsuit. It's billionaires trying to get the government to sue other billionaires. It has very little, if nothing really, to do with consumers. That's the government's problem with its case against Google. Even the judge, who seemed to have some sympathy with some of the government's arguments, dismissed 4 of the 7 main arguments the government had in the Google case, saying, well, look, if the federal government and the state suing Google are saying that the likes of Yelp and TripAdvisor are not having their search results properly ranked in Google, who cares? You know, that's not consumers' problem. That's the competitors' problem. And they're just using the government to make this argument. He threw those out. They're really focused now on whether the agreement between Google and Apple to have Google's search engine on Apple's devices preferenced, preloaded. And even though people could choose another search engine, the government's arguing, well, they mostly don't. Again, sorry, Microsoft, that Bing is not competitive with Google's search engine, but people are choosing one over the other. And we recently took a poll on this of New Hampshire voters, Republicans. And one of the things we asked was, assuming the government's activities in this area go on, what do you think some of the negative consequences would be? And the number one answer was, they're going to start charging us for Google searches. And I mean, granted, Google has an advertising and data-driven model that allows the searches to occur without consumers paying for them out of pocket, but that's just one outcome of the government's prosecutorial mindset here. People will end up paying for services that they don't actually have to subscribe to out of pocket. Companies could get broken up. And okay, it's fine when that happens through the marketplace, but when government does it, the results are often very messy. We've seen that. We've seen that in shoe industry, the steel industry, all kinds of industries where antitrust activity was supposed to help, but it hurt.
Yep. No, that's a great point. I agree with you. Kind of playing devil's advocate a little bit here, I guess, you know, because you get this from the left and the right. There's some on the right who right now will say, you know what, Google is not looking out for the consumer. They're going down this woke route. Amazon's going down this woke route, and you know, maybe they shouldn't be so big. They shouldn't have so much influence over our lives. We're seeing this a lot in social media. You know, they're calling them all big tech now, quote unquote big tech. And you know, to some extent, I get the point that maybe they are having quite a bit of influence on our lives. But my other concern is that that's also just a top-down approach to try to weed out what we want by government doing it instead of the marketplace. But what have you also noticed that maybe is from both sides we're getting some of this action?
Yeah, people will hold these services accountable one way or another. We have seen what happens to companies that ignore consumer preferences for some other kind of political agenda. Case in point, Bud Light. I mean, that just happens. And I make no judgment as to whether Bud Light had that coming or not, but consumers were able to exercise market power there. They've done the same in the tech space.
Yeah.
I remember I have in my office an article here from the New York Times way back in 2015 saying, will MySpace conquer the internet to the detriment of all? No, it didn't.
Nope.
And,
Nope.
there are already tech industry observers saying, you know what? Google's business model that relied on advertising and data from users is already going to give way to other business models based on AI, for example. And so the door is going to be open again for other innovators to catch up and take Google down unless Google continues to innovate. That's kind of the way it works in our economy. And Microsoft CEO testified in the Google trial saying we invested billions trying to do a better search experience and we couldn't beat Google. Sorry.
Yep.
You know, that's the way it sometimes happens. It doesn't mean it will always happen. It doesn't mean government is the one to make the judgment call here and start breaking up companies.
Yeah. No, a great point there. Again, it reminded me of something. I recently had former U.S. Senator Phil Gramm on the show, and we talked about inequality and income inequality with his new book, The Myth of U.S. Inequality. And we talked a lot about envy and how a lot of this is built on envy, whether it's one group or another in income. But it almost seems like, from your points you were just making, which were great points, is that we're feeling this envy between different businesses. I mean, It's always like we want to be the biggest, we want to be the baddest and everything else, and really be out there for the marketplace. And it seems like maybe government is wanting to come in, direct the resources where they want it to go, which, like you said, and I agree with that, it'll turn out bad. And Milton Friedman, I'd love to see that video if y'all still have it whenever you're recording.
Yes.
He's my favorite economist. I got one of his books over here on my shelf, and I've learned so much from him and Loew von Mises and others about, and Hayek, about the role of competition. Another one that comes to mind is Joseph Schumpeter, who talked about creative destruction. And you need this in the marketplace, but not through government top-down approach, because then you're not allowing for consumers to determine where the resources are going to go. You have the government with all their knowledge problems, issues, and everything else doing that. And it seems to me, Pete, that we're not putting enough power in the hands of the consumer, that they aren't going to make the right decisions, quote unquote, right decisions. And so we need to do it for them. And that happens with taxes, that happens with spending and a lot of other corporate welfare. But do you think some of that is there, kind of this envy issue and other things going on?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Okay. There's a total disrespect for the mentality and the capacity of consumers to make judgments that are in their own best interests, which is in the marketplace's best interests. I mean, we can talk about economists who are very learned, like Friedman and Schumpeter. I like to use the version from the old cartoon, The Jetsons. I mean, imagine if Spacely Sprockets wanted a tax write-off for sprockets that would disadvantage Cogswell Cogs, or they wanted a loan program because Spacely Sprockets are in the national security interest, and Cogswell Cogs, well, they just make stuff that are junk for consumers. Well, that's what antitrust is just like. They're saying, well, Cogswell Cogs is getting too big, so Spacely Sprockets wants the government to sue and break them up. All three of these examples contain the common element you just identified. It's government weighing in and putting its thumb on a scale, and that thumb is big and clumsy.
Yeah, it is. Well, as we're getting closer to the end here and wrapping up, what do you think are some guardrails? Speaking of guardrails in the tax front, what are some guardrails in the AI, the technology area that we should be thinking about to make sure that, for one thing, you have certainty in the marketplace? I think businesses like that. That's one reason why some businesses, I believe, are arguing for more regulation, because they just want to know what the future is going to hold, which will end up hurting a lot of the smaller businesses, unfortunately. But how can we put in some guardrails to make sure that government doesn't intervene so much in these markets?
I think one of the things we can do certainly is focus on where kids need to be protected. I mean, there can be sensible laws there that don't go too far. if policymakers take a step back, actually get into a room with AI experts and say, what will work here that can be a regulation across most platforms that won't interfere with the development of beneficial AI. We also have to take a look at government's role here. All too many of these privacy protections and regulations that get enacted supposedly for our own good to keep big bad companies from hurting us never apply to government. How much more information is government going to be allowed to collect from us, especially from the IRS, from the CFPB, the Consumer Protection Agency, and FTC? They need to be under similar or same restrictions of whatever Congress chooses to enact. We also need, I think, to take a look at taxpayer rights in these questions. When the IRS, for example, is using AI to answer taxpayer inquiries, I don't believe most folks using that understand that that advice cannot be relied on the same way that written advice from a human at the IRS can. You cannot take a print off something that a chatbot at IRS tells you to do on your tax return and say, okay, here's evidence that I did this right. If the IRS audits me or takes me to court, I have protection. You don't. And AI needs to be defined in a way that protects taxpayers from getting caught in that situation.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Two last questions, and then we'll wrap up. The one is what do you think about AI though in general? People are concerned about how it's going to replace jobs, and it's going to, Chat GPT is going to take over jobs, and just this mentality that it's going to be a huge cost, and we're going to lose a lot of jobs in the process. And the last thing is to put it all together. Maybe it all goes together. Are you optimistic about the future and how we can let people prosper given technology and taxes and other things? Those are two big questions, but what would you say about those?
Virtually every new technology, especially in the information area, gives rise to some fear that we're losing power in the marketplace. But we always have that power. As much as governments try to take it away from us, as much as we may feel uncomfortable with new technologies, our money, our time, our effort still drives the decisions that marketers make. If we are scared about AI and its implications, we have the power to pull it back by voting with our own dollars. I remain convinced of that, and I remain optimistic over it. The thing we need to worry about is regulators doing the wrong kinds of policy that will choke off the benefits of AI and still give us all of the liabilities that they want to use against us. We've got to guard over that. Also, I think there are pro-taxpayer AI cooperative policies that are actually being developed overseas that U.S. policymakers should learn from. We've got a lot about that on our website, ntu.org, that we've written about recently. And am I optimistic about the future? Yeah, I remain so, because the information age works both ways. It can give governments a leg up in trying to sneak through unwise regulations or tax policies, but can also alert us very quickly to those policies. I mean, when I think of the trouble when I first started at NTU, just trying to get an initiative petition campaign going to limit taxes in a given state or locality, what you had to do, you had to know people's phone numbers and call up the activists and send out mailings of petitions for people. You can do all of that online and have an instant campaign to limit taxes or spending anywhere in the country where the law permits it, online in a matter of a couple of days. So if we use those tools wisely on behalf of taxpayers, even as the government tries to use them against taxpayers, we can still prevail.
Yeah. Great words, wise words, as you use that word wisely. Well, I really appreciate all that you're doing and what NTU is doing. And thank you for all your efforts. And, God bless you and your family, Pete. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.
I do as well.
Great. For the audience, thank y'all for listening today. Please leave us a 5-star rating and go and rate and review and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast. And until next time, let people prosper.